York City, 1983. The air is thick with energy. The streets hum with the sound of honking taxis, distant sirens, and the chatter of people moving from one place to another. The city never sleeps, and neither do its artists. Michael Stewart, a young artist with a quiet confidence, walks these streets with a purpose. He carries his sketchbook wherever he goes, filling its pages with ideas, faces, and abstract shapes. His world is vibrant, filled with music, creativity, and the pulse of a city that is constantly changing. But in the background, there is another side of the city. A side filled with tension. The flashing red and blue lights. The feeling of being watched. The way some people disappear into the night, and no one asks why. Tonight, Michael doesn't know that he is walking toward the last hours of his life. It's a warm September night. The sidewalks are packed with people heading to bars, clubs, and late-night diners. The street lights cast a yellow glow on the pavement, stretching long shadows across the road. Michael moves through the city with ease. He is dressed in a simple button-up shirt, dark jeans, and sneakers, comfortable, casual, the kind of outfit that allows him to blend in. His dreadlocks are neatly tied back. He's heading to the Pyramid Club, a place that feels like home. Inside the club, the air is electric. Music pounds through the speakers' heavy bass, sharp beats. People are dancing, moving together in rhythm. The crowd is a mix of artists, musicians, drag queens, and dreamers. This is where the underground scene thrives. Michael greets friends with a nod, exchanging quick words before making his way toward the bar. He orders a drink, leans against the counter, and watches. He always watches. His artist's mind captures moments, how the light reflects off a glass, the way a stranger's laughter shapes their face, the movement of bodies in the dark. His sketchbook is in his bag, waiting. It's late when Michael leaves the club. The streets have thinned out, quieter now but not empty. The occasional car speeds by, its headlights cutting through the darkness. He walks toward the subway. The station entrance is dimly lit, the metal railing cool under his fingers as he descends the stairs. The air down here is different, stale, with the lingering scent of sweat and concrete. The distant sound of a train echoes through the tunnel. He moves toward a tiled wall, reaching into his bag. His fingers close around a can of spray paint. A simple act, an expression of creativity, of identity. The hiss of the paint fills the silence as lines begin to take shape. But then footsteps. Heavy. Fast. A voice, sharp and commanding. Michael turns, his heart pounding. Two figures in uniform stand before him. Their eyes lock onto him, their faces unreadable. The moment stretches. A choice must be made. And then, the world tilts. The city blurs. The ground is cold beneath him. A distant ringing in his ears. Shapes moving around him. Voices. Some loud, some fading. The red and blue lights swirl, reflecting off nearby windows. A crowd has gathered. Faces filled with concern, with fear, with confusion. Michael's breath is shallow. His body is still. The city moves on. The taxis keep driving. The music still plays in the clubs. Somewhere, someone is laughing. Someone is dreaming. But for Michael Stewart, the night has ended. The East Village, Manhattan. A neighborhood where the old and the new collided every day. The streets were covered in graffiti, some of it art, some of it just tags scrawled in hurried strokes. Walls were layered with posters, some peeling, revealing older ones beneath. The sidewalks were cracked, littered with cigarette butts and crushed beer cans. The smell of hot pretzels and street food mixed with the damp, metallic scent of the subway grates. At night, the city transformed. Neon lights flickered, casting an eerie glow onto the wet pavement. Music poured out from open doors of bars and clubs, punk rock from one, jazz from another. People moved fast, some in groups, others alone, heads down, hands deep in their pockets. The streets were alive, buzzing with restless energy. This was New York in the 1980s, a place of opportunity, but also danger. A place where artists and dreamers thrived, but where the wrong step at the wrong time could change everything. The city was a canvas. Buildings became galleries, subway cars became moving murals. Young artists were shaping a new era. Street art was no longer just vandalism, it was a voice. It was rebellion. It was culture. Jean-Michel Basquiat, with his raw, chaotic strokes, was making a name for himself. Keith Haring, with his bold, playful figures, was turning subway stations into art exhibits. Graffiti wasn't just on the outskirts, it was creeping into galleries, into museums. It was becoming something more. But for many, the act of creating was still risky. The city had strict laws. Spray painting on public property was illegal, and getting caught could mean trouble. The police cracked down hard on graffiti artists, seeing them as vandals rather than visionaries. Michael Stewart was part of this movement. He wasn't famous yet, but he had talent. He had something to say. If you wanted to find the heart of the underground art scene, you went to the Pyramid Club. It wasn't just a nightclub, it was a sanctuary. A place where the rules of society didn't matter. Inside, the walls were covered with murals and neon signs. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of cheap beer. The dance floor was packed, people moving wildly, lost in the music. Strobe lights flashed, catching glimpses of faces, some painted, some masked, some laughing. Drag queens in extravagant outfits took the stage, commanding the room. Poets stood in corners, scribbling words in notebooks. Painters discussed their latest work, arguing about meaning, about art, about life. Michael was a part of it all. He didn't just watch, he absorbed. Every face, every movement, every color, he stored them in his mind, in his sketchbook. He felt at home here. But even in a place of freedom, the outside world still waited. And for Michael, that world would soon close in. Brooklyn, 1958. A neighborhood of brownstone buildings and tight-knit communities. The streets were lined with children playing, their laughter echoing between the brick facades. The summers were hot, the asphalt radiating heat, and fire hydrants became makeshift water parks. Michael Stewart grew up here, in a modest home filled with books and the quiet hum of a working-class family. His mother, a schoolteacher, believed in education and discipline. His father, a veteran and transit worker, carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. They taught their children the value of hard work, the importance of dreams, but also the reality of limits. Michael was the oldest of four. He took that role seriously. He helped his younger siblings with homework, watched over them at the park, made sure they stayed out of trouble. But Michael wasn't like the other kids. He wasn't drawn to sports or roughhousing in the streets. He was drawn to art. Michael's world was filled with color. He saw beauty in the ordinary, the curve of a fire escape, the patterns in broken sidewalks, the graffiti that told stories no one else seemed to notice. He sketched constantly. On napkins at the dinner table. On the backs of old photographs. On notebooks meant for schoolwork but filled instead with faces, hands, cityscapes. His mother would find his drawings tucked into books, on scraps of paper left around the house. He wasn't just good. He had something special, an eye for movement, for energy, for life. In high school, teachers noticed his talent, encouraged him, pushed him to apply to the Pratt Institute, one of the most prestigious art schools in New York. When he got in, it felt like a dream. But art school wasn't easy. Michael struggled with academics. The structure, the deadlines, the pressure, it weighed on him. He wasn't the kind of student who thrived in classrooms. He learned by doing, by seeing, by feeling. Still, He never stopped creating. His dream: to paint murals across the country. To take what he saw in his mind and put it on walls, on buildings, in places where people could feel it. He wanted to leave a mark. Not just in galleries, but in the streets. To support himself, Michael took a job as a busboy at the Pyramid Club. It was supposed to be temporary, just a way to make money while he figured things out. But the Pyramid wasn't just a job. It became home. The club was unlike anything else. It wasn't just a place to drink and dance, it was a space where people could be whoever they wanted to be. The air smelled of sweat, beer, and cigarettes. The music was loud punk one night, experimental jazz the next. Drag queens performed under flashing lights, their voices commanding the crowd. Michael wasn't just another employee. He was part of the scene. He talked to the artists, the musicians, the dancers. He listened to their stories, watched their performances, sketched them when they weren't looking. Even after he lost his job, he kept coming back. Because the Pyramid wasn't just a nightclub. It was where he belonged. The late summer sun hung low over New York City, casting long shadows across the Brooklyn Bridge. Michael Stewart pedaled across the bridge on his bicycle, weaving through pedestrians and slow-moving cars. The air was thick with the scent of hot asphalt, distant food carts, and the occasional gust of river breeze. That afternoon, Michael visited his studio, a small, cluttered space filled with unfinished sketches and tubes of paint. The walls were covered in his work, vibrant murals, and abstract figures that seemed to dance in the dim light. Later, he met up with his girlfriend, Suzanne Malouk, at a cafe. They sat in a quiet corner, sipping coffee, their conversation drifting between art, the city, and their future. Michael's eyes were always full of ideas, of dreams too big to contain. Suzanne could see it. She loved that about him. As the evening settled in, he headed to Lucky Strike, a bar known for its artists, poets, and musicians. He had a few drinks, laughed with friends, let the music sink into him. The city was alive, pulsing with energy. It was just another night. Or so he thought. By midnight, Michael was at the Pyramid Club. The neon glow from the sign flickered against the sidewalk, a beacon for the city's misfits and visionaries. Inside, the club pulsed with music, thumping bass, echoing laughter, the occasional burst of applause for a performance on stage. Michael was in high spirits. He moved through the crowd, greeting friends, sharing drinks. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of cheap beer. People danced without inhibition, their bodies swaying under the dim, colorful lights. For a moment, he was lost in it, the music, the movement, the feeling of being young and invincible in a city that never slept. Then, around 2 a.m., he stepped outside. Maybe for fresh air. Maybe to head home. Maybe for something else. The streets were quieter now, though the hum of the city never truly faded. A few cabs rolled by. The occasional drunk couple stumbled down the sidewalk, laughing loudly. Michael stood there for a moment, his breath visible in the cool night air. Then he turned and walked toward the subway. The entrance to the First Avenue L train station was mostly deserted. A few stragglers leaned against the metal barriers, waiting for a late-night train. The glow of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting an eerie, washed-out hue over the tiled walls. Michael made his way down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the near-empty space. Then something. A moment. A choice. A marker in his hand. A wall in front of him. Reports would later say he was seen holding the marker near a freshly tagged surface. No one could confirm if he had actually written anything. But in a city where graffiti was both an art form and a crime, perception mattered more than truth. A figure approached. Then another. Uniforms. Badges. Officers. The air shifted. Words were exchanged, though no one could later agree on what was said. A hand reached out. Then another. Michael tensed. He pulled back. Then movement. A confrontation. A struggle. The walls of the subway station, once covered in the quiet hum of late-night travelers, now bore witness to something else. A young artist. 6 officers. And a moment that would change everything. The city moved on, as it always did. But for those who knew Michael Stewart, the night of September 14, 1983, did not fade away. The official police report painted a simple story: Michael resisted arrest. He struggled. Officers had no choice but to subdue him. But others, bystanders, those who saw flashes of the scene, told a different story. Some said Michael was already in handcuffs when he collapsed. That he wasn't fighting. That the officers had pressed him against the pavement for too long. Others claimed he was dragged, his body limp, his head hanging unnaturally to the side. The truth? It was hard to find. The only thing certain was that when Michael Stewart left the First Avenue subway station that night, he was never the same again. The air inside the ambulance was thick with the sharp scent of antiseptic and something metallic, blood, maybe. The paramedics worked quickly, their hands moving with the practiced precision of people who had seen too much. Michael's body was unresponsive. His chest barely moved. His skin, once full of warmth, was taking on a grayish hue. One of the medics glanced at his partner. A look passed between them. They both knew. The sirens screamed through the city, cutting through the silence of the late-night streets. But inside, the only sounds were the beeping of the monitors, the whispered calls of his name, and the frantic attempts to keep him alive. When Michael Stewart arrived at Bellevue Hospital, doctors moved quickly. His pupils were unresponsive. His breathing was shallow. His heartbeat weak. Suzanne arrived not long after. Her hands trembled as she pushed through the sterile hallways, her mind refusing to accept what she had been told. She saw him lying there, surrounded by machines, tubes running from his mouth and arms. His face, once so full of life, was swollen, bruised. She reached for his hand. It was cold. Days passed. Then a week. Then more. Michael never woke up. The city outside continued as if nothing had happened. People walked the streets, taxis honked, music played. But in one hospital room, time had stopped. On September 28, 1983, 13 days after that night in the subway, Michael Stewart took his last breath. The machines beeped one final time. Then silence. He was gone. Michael Stewart was just 25 years old. A young artist. A dreamer. A man with his whole life ahead of him. His family stood in the hospital room, staring at the still body of their son, their brother. How could this have happened? They wanted answers. His mother, Marion, refused to accept silence. She demanded an investigation. She demanded to know why her son, who had left home full of life, was now lying in a morgue. His friends were in shock. The Pyramid Club, once filled with music and laughter, felt different now. The people who had danced with Michael, who had seen his sketches and heard his dreams, now spoke in hushed tones. The city. It was divided. Some believed the official report. They said Michael had resisted, that the officers had done their job. Others saw a pattern: another young black man harmed in police custody. Another life taken too soon. And the officers? They faced trial. The medical examiner ruled Michael's death a homicide. But in the end, no one was convicted. But Michael was not forgotten. His name became a symbol, a name whispered in protests, written in articles, painted on murals. A reminder of the thin line between justice and injustice. Artists paid tribute to him. Jean-Michel Basquiat, who had once walked the same streets, breathed the same air, painted a piece titled Defacement, The Death of Michael Stewart. A haunting image, filled with pain and rage. Musicians wrote about him. Poets spoke his name. His story was told in books, in classrooms, in hushed conversations between parents and children. The East Village changed over the years. The clubs, the graffiti-covered walls, the underground art scene, some of it faded, lost to time. But Michael's story remained. A reminder. A warning. Michael Stewart had dreams. He had talent. He had a future. But on a quiet night in New York City, his story was rewritten. And today, we remember. If Michael Stewart's story moved you, if you believe stories like his deserve to be heard, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. Every like, every share helps keep these stories alive. It helps bring awareness to voices that were silenced too soon. And if you want more true crime stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering.